Now that you're a bit more comfortable with Laravel's service container, let's switch over to service providers, another core concept. Let's go into my app directory, providers, and you'll see we've included a handful out of the box to get you started. A provider related to routing and events and broadcasting events to the client, authentication, and then a standard application service provider. And this is a good place to put any initial work that needs to be registered or booted. But now you might be wondering, okay, we had these providers. You're probably still a little blurry on when would I reach for this, why do I care, and where are they stored? Well, just go with me. I'm now going to go into my config directory into app.php, our application config. And if I scroll down, this is where things like your current environment are stored, whether or not we want debug mode turned on, the application URL. But if I keep scrolling, you're going to find a section for autoloaded service providers. So if we think of Laravel as the product of any number of components, well, each of these components needs to make itself known to the framework, right? It needs to register itself with the framework. So if we scroll down here, we can see this is all, think of them like Lego pieces. These are the building blocks of the framework. For example, we have one for database access. We have one for your caching layer, for your authentication layer. And in fact, if you ever want to hunt around, we talked about this a bit many episodes ago. You can go into the vendor directory, Laravel, framework, source, and then here's all the components that make up the Laravel framework. You can pick any of them. How about database? All right. Every component should have a service provider. Again, think of this as a class that is responsible for bootstrapping whatever it is your code or your package does with the Laravel framework. So if we scroll down, we can see, all right, this is how we register the database component with the framework. And as it turns out, for any service provider you have, let's switch back into app providers, and we'll stick with this one out of the box. For any service provider that you have, you'll have two core methods on this contract, register and boot. Now, in general, register is where you will bind things into the service container, like we reviewed in the last episode. So here's where you could say app bind, or you can access app as a property, exact same thing. So I could say bind foo into the container, or make foo a singleton that always returns, how about a bar, just as a quick dummy example, and then we will review some real world examples. So here we can see we've bound a singleton called foo into the container, and whenever I resolve it, I'm going to get the string bar. And you can try this out anywhere. So in my route/web file, here's where we were tinkering around in the last episode. I'll clear that out. Let's just die and dump, and we're going to look into our application for the key foo. All right, so if I switch over and load that in the browser, we get bar. Hopefully it's starting to make more sense. And again, within that config/app directory where we registered it, in my mini-map, you can see all of them down here. So you'll see if I keep scrolling down, here's where all of your application service providers are stored. And again, for every item in this array, we will load the associated file. So here's app service provider, and as a result, we load this file. Now let's get back to register versus boot. This is often very confusing. Register is a method that's going to fire for every single service provider that's declared here. For every single one of those, a register method will be called. And that is where, once again, you can register things into Laravel service container. However, sometimes you want to do something assuming the rest of the framework is basically loaded up. And that's what the boot method is for. So once again, I just want to reiterate to make this crystal clear. For every single service provider, Laravel is going to loop over and call a register method. This primarily is where you bind things into the container. Now, once that process is done, Laravel is going to do it one more time. It's going to filter through all of them and then call a boot method. So here is where you can reference basically anything that uses the Laravel framework, because at the point the boot method is called, the framework is loaded up and it's all set to go. So hopefully this is beginning to make sense. So to use the example from the last episode of this Twitter class that needs an API key in its constructor, well, that's something you may want to do behind the scenes. Okay, well here we could just say, let's grab that Twitter class. And we now have that right up here. Okay, so when we try to resolve this class out of the container, we're going to return a new instance of that class with the API key that was given to you through Twitter. And again, often you don't want to hard code these keys directly into your source code. You instead want to reference it from an environment file that you then load through your config. Might be a little confusing. We'll have a full lesson dedicated to that. Until then, just know you'd probably do something like this. I'm just going to hard code it for now to keep it simple. All right, so now we know our app service provider is loaded for every request. And as part of that request, we're going to register this key into Laravel service container. And when we ever request it or we resolve it out of the container, we're going to return a new instance of Twitter with the API key already populated. So if we give this a shot now, once again in our route homepage, we're going to take advantage of auto resolution that we learned about in the last episode. So I'm going to say here, yeah, I want an instance of my Twitter class. And all I'm going to do is die and dump that for your review. Okay, so we switch back, we give it a refresh. Looks like we forgot a colon here. Anyways, we give that a refresh, and there you go. Now, anytime you resolve this out of the container, you get your object with the API key already populated. So that means App Service Provider is often a good entry place for things like this. However, it may be possible that this grows. The things you have to do for Twitter expand. Or maybe you have one for Twitter, one for Facebook, one for Instagram. And at that point, you might want to create a dedicated service provider specifically for that. You might feel the need to do that when this file ends up getting a little bloated and you're just doing too many things here over the lifetime of your project. All right, let's make a new provider. PHP Artisan, make a provider called, let's just call it Social Service Provider. Okay, so now in your providers directory, you'll have a new one here. So that means you could clean this up and move it over here, like so. But now, be careful. If you switch back to Safari and give it a refresh, and instead we're going to get a binding resolution exception. So do you understand why? The answer is this code is never being executed. So if I were to say hello, we can prove it. We're never loading this file because we didn't declare it as a service provider for our application. We just created a file, but we didn't yet declare it. Now, before we fix that, I do want to explain why we got this somewhat cryptic error. The answer is, well, remember, if we're trying to resolve Twitter, Laravel, as we learned in the last episode, is smart enough to know, okay, well, there is a class called Twitter. So maybe that's all you want, and I'm just going to instantiate that for you. However, it came to the Twitter class, and it came across this API key. And because we have nothing associated with that, Laravel didn't know, like we didn't type hint it, so Laravel didn't know what to pass through there, so it just fails and says, unresolvable dependency, I don't know what you want there, so I'm just going to error out. That's what's happening there. Okay, anyways, let's fix it though. So we're going to go back into our config directory, into that app file, and if I scroll down, here's where all of our application level service providers, anything for our specific application. At the very bottom, I'll duplicate this line, and we're now going to declare our new social service provider. Okay, so now you'll see that we do hit this line of code. Refresh, and now because it is included in that array, we will load the service provider for every request. Great. So actually real quick, let's make sure we import Twitter. There we go. Anyways, if we switch back to Safari, now we have the same thing that we had before, but we cleaned up our code a little bit. And this is where you would have everything related to maybe booting up Twitter or your various social networking clients. Maybe OAuth information would go here, whatever is necessary. Let me show you a couple of other examples I have here. Here's one many developers create. It's called Backend Service Provider. So maybe for the type of application you're working with, you're fairly religious about coding to an interface, which means whether on a controller or any other class, you don't want to depend upon a concrete class. You instead want to depend upon a interface, maybe something like this. Okay, well think about it. If you're going to type hint an interface like that, you still need some place to wire up which concrete class you want to use on that condition. Or in other words, this is our way of saying, all right, well, if I ever type hint that I need some kind of interface, some kind of implementation of an interface, here is the implementation that I want to use. So that kind of binding can once again be wired up in a service provider. Let me show you an example of this, and then I think we'll call it a day. So we'll copy that. Let's store all of this once again within our providers in app service provider. Okay, so we'll store that right here. Now I'm going to update these and we'll say, all right, well, maybe we're dealing with repositories and we'll say, okay, we have a user repository. And for now, we're going to stick with our database implementation. Maybe you could have multiple different ways of querying and fetching and storing users. But for now, you don't want to lock yourself, maybe for the type of project you're working on. You don't feel comfortable locking yourself to the database. So we're going to tuck this behind an implementation, and then you can easily swap those out if you need to. All right, for your project, fair enough. So let's go ahead and create some example versions of these. We'll say app, I'm going to build a new repositories folder, and we have a user repository interface. The namespace will be app repositories, and our interface, user repository. I like to think of interfaces sort of like agreements or contracts. If you want to implement me, the interface, then as part of that contract, you need to offer these methods because any implementation or any user will depend upon those. So in this case, maybe for users, you're going to expect some way to create a user. And let's just leave it like that for now, but you could expand upon that later. Okay, we have our contract. We'll next have an implementation. And again, in this particular example, I actually don't often recommend this approach. I think it can often complicate your code needlessly. But we're assuming your team has thought about all of this and you've decided, no, this is very much the way to go for, given the context of the project we're working on. Okay, fair enough. So let me copy that and we'll say, all right, we have a class called DB user repository that implements the repository interface. And then here, when we create a user, I'm just going to die and dump and say create the user. But yeah, here it might be where you tuck some of your eloquent specific code. Okay, does this all make sense? You now have a contract for working with users, and now you have a specific implementation here that conforms to the terms of that contract. So now anywhere in your code, let's say here, let's clean some of this up again. Okay, let's say here, you want to work with users. So we expect an implementation of user repository. And again, think of a repository sort of like a collection of a given thing. And we'll die and dump that. And I want to try this out, but real quick, let's comment this out for now and figure out what's going to happen. All right, well, we type hinted user repository. Nothing's in the service container, so Laravel is going to say, all right, well, we do have a file named user repository. So let's just see if we can instantiate that for the user. But if we run it, nope, another binding resolution exception. Laravel saying, hey, you gave me a contract, you gave me an interface. I can't instantiate that. I don't know what to do here. So it blows up. All right, let's switch back to our service provider. And now we're telling the framework, well, if you ever need an implementation of user repository, here is the one that I want to use at the moment. Okay, so now if we come back and give it a refresh, we are now type hinting an interface, but receiving an implementation of that interface. And again, just a heads up, a guideline here. Things like this I don't recommend out of the box. I think developers are a little too quick to reach for things like this in an attempt to isolate and follow the techniques from a book you read. If you know what you're doing and if you have a very good reason why it's important to separate things in this way, then of course have at it. But if you want a general rule of thumb, I would say keep it simple. If you're building a Laravel application, embrace Eloquent and all that it offers and stop trying to fight the framework. Just kind of go with it. You can if you want, of course. You can build an application however you want in Laravel. But in general, unless you have a good reason not to, I would recommend just kind of go with the flow and embrace Eloquent. I think you'll be happier that way. Nonetheless, this is an option that's available to you. Maybe a bit higher level than where we currently are, but for those of you who need it, you now know it's available. So in conclusion, service providers are the building blocks of the Laravel framework. Laravel is constructed through various components. Each of these components contains a service provider that knows how to register and bootstrap itself with the framework. Now, on top of that, you can create your own service providers when and if you need to. And down the line, you might even create your own packages that are distributed through Composer. And for those packages, they will need to know how to register themselves with the user's framework, with the user's Laravel installation. And again, you would create a service provider to do that very thing. Once it's registered, again, if there's anything you need to do in the boot method, assuming all of Laravel is loaded, the boot method would be the place you take care of that. Again, if that felt a little scary, maybe a little over your head, no problem whatsoever. Just understand and recognize when you see service provider, okay, that's a class for registering and bootstrapping some kind of component or thing with your framework. And that should take you a long way before you need to learn more.